First off, hello everyone. Thank you all very much for coming out. It's very much appreciated. And as we can see here, can we do the light? Yeah, thank you. The lights off, make it show a little bit more clearly. As we all know, we are fast approaching the 400-year anniversary, also known as the quadricentennial amongst some historians, to what is the first Thanksgiving, as Ann just alluded to. I believe that this is a great time to gain understanding of who the members involved were at this gathering, namely the Wampanoags as well as the Pilgrims. I also believe that it's important to know who these people were. I feel as though if there is a greater sense of these identities, then the understanding of this day offers us greater knowledge of what this gathering was all about. As well, as we are aware, this subject has rightfully garnered much debate. With that said, this presentation is not aimed to be political in nature. It is designed to be talking about this very popular holiday, a secular holiday that I would say quite easily, I would argue, rivals that of the 4th of July, as well as other popular secular holidays. I want to be clear, this presentation is designed to present an overarching view of these two distinctly different people involved from different cultures, politics, religion, and spirituality. I say religion and spirituality because the Pilgrims certainly were religious and the Wampanoags certainly were spiritual. And this is not based on original research, and it's not a thesis-based presentation. Again, it's an overarching perspective to look at different aspects of these two distinctly different people and to gain an understanding of the holiday. Lastly, the goal is hopefully for all of you to leave here tonight. If you leave here with at least a few different pieces of information about this gathering, I will have done my job, and that's really what my goal is. I also, before I start, I want to thank Ann Campbell as well as Jennifer Mealy for having me here. I'd like to thank the Groton Public Library and the Circle of Friends for hosting this as well. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out here tonight. It's appreciated. I also want to acknowledge a subject that has been talked about quite a bit, and I just feel as though it's my responsibility, and I think it's the responsibility of any and all historians to address the fact that there has been violence, dislocation, and difficult historical actions amongst not only the Wampanoag Native Americans over the past 400 years, but also to Native Americans throughout the North American continent. And I don't want to minimize this, but I thought tonight's discussion would be best, as I said, really to talk and focus on the first year of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags' relationship together. So I'm not minimizing this. I just simply want to make sure that that's talked about. Before I get started, I want to make you aware, out of deference to the Wampanoag people, I'm going to use their names that I understand them have given themselves, and I apologize up front if there's any wrongful pronunciation. Sometimes there are multiple different pronunciations from what I have read and I have seen throughout various videos. And then the last thing before we start, this is something that a lot of people have asked about this when it comes to this period of time. And I don't think people who write monographs or periodicals in the past, or basically history books, sometimes have done a very good service. But I want to clarify the difference between what a pilgrim, a Puritan, and a separatist is. Okay, it's really kind of in the name. The Pilgrims went on a pilgrimage. The separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England, and the Puritans wanted to purify it. So the separatists are, in fact, Puritans. So you may hear me referring to separatist Puritans. That's not to be confused with the Puritans in 1630 that went on what I would argue would be an English diaspora out of England due to King Charles I that went to Boston. Okay, so the Puritans who went to Boston certainly were Puritans, but the separatists, or the separatist Puritans that were on the Mayflower, were Puritans as well. But they are the ones who are pilgrims, because they are the ones who went on a pilgrimage. So what's going on with the Wampanoags before 1620? And this is significant because although my discussion tonight isn't really dependence-based, I do believe there was a lot of dependence on both sides of the aisle. Whether or not that dependence on each other was of equal importance at the same time, that is debatable. But if we get a general idea of what is going on with the Wampanoags prior to 1620, a few years leading up to that, we can gain a greater understanding of what's happening with our community. So a brief identification of what's going on prior to the Mayflower. First, the Wampanoags. It is worth mentioning that at this time, the Native Americans that were in what is presently constituted to be Plymouth, Massachusetts, were referred to as the Pokanockets. Okay, they didn't become the Wampanoags, identified as the Wampanoags, until nearly a century after that period of time. They did experience, as it is fairly well known, a decimating plague, likely to have been smallpox that ravaged the New England seaboard between 1617 and 1618. Importantly, it has been believed in the past that the Wampanoag peoples were wiped out. We know this is clearly not the case. They remain a vibrant community today, but certainly the epidemic did certainly do quite a bit of decimation damage to that community. However, the epidemic is significant, and that it not only affected the neighboring affect the neighboring counterparts, the Narragansetts. The Narragansetts at this time, we know Narragansett now to be in southern Rhode Island. At that time, the Narragansetts were considerably further. They were in southern Rhode Island, but they were certainly in more of a central Rhode Island as well. And they were rivals. I think that's a cautionary term because rivals can become a kind of a malleable term. Sometimes you get along with people, sometimes you don't, and sometimes you're trying to get tributaries. So that certainly can be debatable. Excuse me, but it certainly does lead if one Native American group is decimated and the other one is not. It certainly puts the group that is decimated at a weaker position militarily and politically within the Native American groups themselves. There is evidence to support that Usamequim is better known as Massasoit. He may have wanted to ally with the Pilgrims due to belief that they had the ability to weaponize disease for their own benefit. So there is evidence to support, and there's argument that's been made that Massasoit or Usamequim is thinking, okay, well, they brought plague, they brought an epidemic. Is this something that the Pilgrims certainly could have controlled? Conversely, there are others within the Wampanoag community, it has been argued, that are saying, we don't want to have a relationship with the Pilgrims because of this reason. So there's two different ways of looking at the same subject. The Massasoit, meaning great sachem, may say, hey, they may be a good ally. Conversely, there may be groups of people within that community that are saying, well, let's kind of back off here and use this with caution. Okay, so what's going on? Moving away from the Wampanoags for a moment, what is going on with some of the characteristics of those people on the Mayflower? Firstly, not all of them were devoutly religious. There were the crew, okay, that were not the separatist Puritans. And then there's also a group of people, interestingly, that were referred to as the strangers. So you have the separatist Puritans that of about approximately 102 people on the Mayflower, approximately 50% of them are the separatists, and then you have a makeup of other people that are by King James I, and the people who are sponsoring the Mayflower are over there, and then of course you have the crew. And so, although there's no evidence to support, or at least the research that I have done, that the strangers of the crew were religious. I'm not saying that they were or they weren't, but they certainly were not considered to be the separatists. So what's going on back in England that adds significance to why it is we want to understand how it is that when the Pilgrims make it here, they want to make it happen. They really want to make it work. Well, first, back in England, King James I had Catholic leanings, and there was also persecution against the Puritans. So as many of us may know, the Church of England certainly is a Protestant religion, and the fact that they did protest in 1534, the Catholic Church. But when you look at it from a religiosity standpoint, the separatist Puritans are Calvinists. Calvin's belief system is certainly very different than that of Roman Catholicism. And the Church of England, although Protestant, just does not have papal authority any longer. The authority lies in the monarchy. It's important to know that it's commonly known that this voyage, the Mayflower voyage over, was quite difficult. They were set off course and needed to compose the Mayflower Compact. And to make matters worse, they showed up in December, which of course is going to be too late to sow their seeds or to start off their community. With respect to the Mayflower Compact, it at very least, I would argue, brought a sense of unity and dependence upon each other. We know that they would need each other because the first few months was devastating. There's clear evidence of that. And the Mayflower became a hospital, essentially to the point where many of the people, due to disease or starvation, were dying. So you had the community, that the plantation that was starting off on land, and then off in distance where the Mayflower was anchored, that would be used as a hospital. And to further support that comment, as I said a moment ago, 102 passengers arrive on the Mayflower, and by the first Thanksgiving, which was approximately 9 to 10 months later, they were down to 54. And we know this based on a letter that I will read a brief passage of from Edward Winslow, one of the two primary sources that we have in writing from the Pilgrim standpoint. And of course, this of course is highly suggestive of a communal dependence on the Wampanoags for survival. Okay, so here comes along Tisquantum, aka also referred to in English as Squanto. This name, Tisquantum, in and of itself, may have its own meaning. The sources are not clear on this. What I mean by that is that the name Tisquantum could have had a meaning much like Massasoit has the name of the great sachem. Tisquantum could have had its own meaning. That said, my goal is to refer to him as Tisquantum because that's the name, as I understand it, he had been given. But like I said, he is commonly referred to as Squanto. Okay, I believe he is arguably the most significant person to the Pilgrims. Others certainly may argue that Usamiquim, also known as Massasoit, or any other Wampanoag may themselves have also been significant. But in tonight's presentation, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Tisquantum because I believe as though he plays a very significant role in the survival of the Pilgrims. But what makes Tisquantum, at a minimum, an interesting case study? And that is that in 1613, it could be 1614, he, along with 20 or 30 other Patuxet Native Americans, which is the tribe just north of where the Wampanoags were, or the Poconuts, he's lured onto a ship by, I believe it is Captain Hunt, with the concept of trade, and then he's kidnapped. After he's kidnapped, he is brought to Spain, and he's going to be sold into slavery. In 1492, the Iberian Peninsula from the Pope Alexander VI, was given the right of the Inter se terra, which was a papal bull that said that people who were not Christianized could be enslaved, but it was specifically more geared towards the Africans and Franciscan friars. I believe the sources are scarce, but Franciscan friars argued that Native Americans could not be brought into slavery, so he did not go into slavery, and if he did, it was a brief period of time. Interestingly, he made his way up to England. It is suggested that he did actually meet Pocahontas, not to get too far off, but Pocahontas is the Native American Powhatan from down in 1607 when John Smith and John Rolfe and the Virginia Company went to Jamestown. Pocahontas, as many of you I'm sure know, Pocahontas ended up marrying John Rolfe and went back to England. So that's where there's that likelihood that they may have met. Interestingly, it is arguable that John Rolfe and Pocahontas was the first interracial marriage that the United States ever had, and that's just kind of it's an interesting point. Excuse me. So the fact that Squanto was able to read, he was able to speak English, and he ended up giving a great level of dependence to the Native Americans, to the Pilgrims, is certainly supportive of a level of dependence. One moment, please. There's something I'd like to read. So I'm going to read this. This is from a primary source. This is from Edward Winslow's letter, and this is referring to Tisquantum's assistance of that of the Pilgrims when the Pilgrims first were trying to start off as their colony. Okay, and I'm getting in the middle of this letter here. Okay, we set the last spring some 20 acres of Indian corn, and sowed some 6 acres of barley and peas. And according to the manner of the Indian, which we can logically assume is going to be Tisquantum, we manured our ground with herrings, or rather shods, which we have in great abundance, and take the great ease to at our doors. Our corn did prove well, and God be praised. I find this primary source, just that section of this primary source, to be interesting. As we know, as we discussed, the separatists are certainly pious religious individuals, and they mention God as giving a sense of aid to this growth, but it also shows a level of dependence. So it didn't say the Indians are supporting us; it was the Indian corn, the corn of this Indian who taught us how to do this. So you can look at this on two different levels, whether from a religiosity standpoint, from the Pilgrim position, or you look at it from Tisquantum's aid, or as I do, you can look at it both ways. Okay, a second key figure that has been briefly mentioned on a couple different occasions so far tonight amongst the Wampanoags is Osamequim, also known as Massasoit. This statue here was just recently taken. It's up on top of Coles Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. If you have ever been to the Plymouth Rock, of course it's right on the water. It's facing the water. And Coles Hill, to the back of you, maybe I wouldn't even say in length, it's 50 yards or so, and then the hill goes up probably another 50 feet or so, and this is the statue of Osamequim, and he's out overlooking the water. And he too, although I argue Tisquanto, he too is a very, very significant God bless you. He too is a very significant Wampanoag when it comes to the relationship of the Pilgrims. Importantly, as I briefly mentioned, Massasoit means the great sachem, but he's referred to quite frequently in the literature as Massasoit. He's equally important, and according to the writings of William Bradford, who is our second, in addition to Edward Winslow. William Bradford is our second primary source that we have, and there's just two as far as primary sources when it comes to writings. The Journal of William Bradford, as well as the letter from Edward Winslow. He writes the fact that there is a great relationship that he had with Osawekum, and this is further evidence to suggest at very minimum, that there was an alliance between these two groups of people, or certainly those two people individually, but they were both the leaders, so there's a logical path to follow there. And certainly, arguably, this is an alliance that would lead to the first Thanksgiving, the event that we're having a discussion tonight. He was the leader of the Wampanoags, and it's unclear whether or not what his involvement was with Tisquantum's aid to that of the Pilgrims. There's nothing clear that I've come across that directly says that Osawekum, or Massasoit, I say that name because of his authority, gave Tisquantum direction. There certainly is evidence to support that, and this is going beyond the period of time that I'm going to discuss tonight, but there certainly is evidence to support that Tisquantum and Osawekum certainly had their differences, whether or not it was a political power struggle or not, or it just happens to be that they had serious differences on politics. That is for a different discussion. There has been discussion recently, not least David Silverman's monograph, This Land is Their Land. He's a professor out of George Washington University, pointing out that the politics may have even played prior to that of the Mayflower landing. As well, it has been documented in other monographs as well as William Bradford's writings. Again, I'm going to get to William Bradford in a moment, about serious conflict that I was just mentioning in 1622. And some historians have postulated that when Tisquantum died in 1622, that it's very possible that he was poisoned at the direction of that of Osawekum. And I'm going to talk about this, but there was a treaty in 1621, and so treaties between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags, if not everybody's agreeing with the treaty or something's going wrong with the treaty, and we see this in today's politics, if things aren't always going along, then you're going to have conflict even within the same groups of people, okay? And this is getting into a little bit more of the politics that I was referring to. That this is really a lot of what I was just referring to a few minutes ago. So who were some of the key English players? Well, as mentioned a couple of times earlier, Governor William Bradford, who succeeded the first governor of Plymouth colony, John Carver, who died shortly after the Mayflower landed, and prior to the event, referring to the first Thanksgiving. So if I have my dates correctly, it was in December of 1620 that the Mayflower landed. It was in March of 1621 that the treaty in 1621 was signed, and then it was in April, so shortly after that. So it's John Carver, just for technical purposes, it's John Carver who signs the treaty with Massasoit. It's not William Bradford. But William Bradford would become the governor of the colony for a long period of time, shortly following that of Carver. And Bradford would remain a key figure for many reasons. Firstly, for writing of Old Plymouth Plantation. That's the second primary source I'm referring to. It's also one of the two primary sources that describes not only what was going on with the Pilgrims, but also that specifically of the first Thanksgiving. This writing of Plymouth Plantation also is significant because it not only talks about the favorable relationship that Tisquantum had with Bradford, it talks about the favorable relationship that he had with Massasoit or Osamequin, but it also talks about the favorable relationship that he had with Hobomok. Hobomok I will briefly discuss in a few minutes, but he'll be of minor detail. So two other English members that are quite noteworthy are, as mentioned a few times, Edward Winslow. The second person who was not a separatist Puritan was Miles Standish, but he's significant because he was a military officer for quite an extensive period of time, and he certainly plays into some of the relationships that go south. He's a veteran of the 30 Years' War, and if you don't recall, the 30 Years' War in Europe was a religious-based war. It started off in 1618 with the defenestration of Prague, when Protestants ended up throwing a Catholic out of a 6 or 7 story window, and that started off the Habsburg and the Protestant wars. And the reason I bring that up is that the war was quite a brutal affair, and Miles Standish was, for at least I'm assuming a year or so, was a military officer at the start of that war. And so there's certainly evidence, if you wanted to really delve into some of the New England Native American relationships with that of the Puritans or the separatist Puritans of this geography and period we're talking about right now, I would certainly encourage you to look up Miles Standish. Winslow, on the other hand, as I mentioned, he has written source about the first Thanksgiving, part of which I just read. His letter, if that's something you're interested in, is very easily accessible online, but it was described in what is referred to as Morton's Relation in England, and it's the very earliest writing of this event. Bradford's plantation writing wasn't until later. Winslow's letter was within a couple of months after that of the event of the first Thanksgiving. So getting into a religion, and as I'm sure, I'm imagining many people would support me on this, whenever you talk about someone's spirituality or someone's religion, you have to really walk a fine line. So I kind of want to start off by saying that, you know, what I'm presenting tonight is what I'm reading from sources that I'm able to obtain, and a lot of those are secondary sources. So primary sources, as a historian, become a lot more easy to analyze, use critical thinking, and kind of make your own assessment. But when you're reading from sources that are coming from another source, I want to say, you know, to take this with that in arm's length. From the Wampanoag standpoint, as I understand it, their spiritual beliefs are I believe, are noteworthy and certainly can offer us some insight into who they were. With respect to the Wampanoag spiritual belief, my sources are limited, as I was just mentioning. My understanding is that the Wampanoags have a spiritual leader identified as a Pawa, that's spelled P-O-W-W-A-W, meaning he or she is healing. The Wampanoags have a creator. They don't have a god. In that nature, humans, animals, wind, air, water, etc., are all part of their spirituality. In other words, it's either ubiquitous, it's all around them. I use the term omnipresence because I take omnipresence to mean a little bit further than ubiquitous, in the sense that omnipresence means everywhere, but I take that to be, my interpretation is that it's in everything. So it's not, you know, we all have smartphones, those are ubiquitous to our community. I would argue omnipresence is far more religious or spiritual based. This is significant for many reasons, least of which is that the Pilgrims did not believe clearly, did not know that the Wampanoags were spiritual people. This is something that historiography has shown, and it certainly is, I don't know if I want to say insulting, but I guess you could argue is insulting, that a lot of, throughout the history of European colonization, Native Americans, I'm including the Wampanoags, but I'm also moving past that, have had a lot of the concept, not perhaps to proselytize, as certainly there was proselytizing, but what's important is that a lot of Christians, and I would include Catholics in this, certainly, or Protestants and Catholics, to give a whole overview of that religion, is that a lot of writings support the fact that the Native Americans weren't thought to have their own religion, which is clearly not the case. There is a plethora of evidence to support the fact that Native Americans did have their own sense of spirituality. It varies, and you can see it. You can see various ways of the way it has been recorded throughout the continental United States over a long period of time, especially if anyone does any reading of the 19th century's Manifest Destiny, when white Protestant men had the feeling, and I say this because Manifest Destiny is just prior to probably the first Catholics to come over in the 1840s due to the potato famine, the German Catholics coming over to what I believe was their civil war. It was predominantly a Protestant movement, and of course the Protestants had a very strong foothold in this country at that period of time. But not to digress and get too far apart, it is highly suggestive that this not believing that other Native Americans had spirituality, it is highly suggestive that this can lead to a pejorative concept of people, in that a better belief was to proselytize one's own faith. This here, what you're looking at here, this is at the Plymouth Hall Museum. This is a copy of the Geneva Bible. It was one of the Geneva Bibles that are still with us, that were on the Mayflower. For those of you, just a quick brief overview, that John Calvin was a very, very devout Protestant. He had brought up prior to the German Protestant Reformation of 1517. He was Catholic, a very devout Catholic. He then, everything that's going on, I'm not going to get into the whole German Protestant Reformation, but he essentially partakes in the Geneva Bible. He goes to Geneva. There are a lot of Puritans because now the Bible, the Catholic Bible, is being translated from Latin to English, the more or to native languages that other people read, and more people can read what it is that Scripture has to say. They certainly have the right to have a different viewpoint on what that does have to say. It is important to note right here that Calvinists, which were clearly the separatist Puritans as well as Puritans, believed in the concept of election. If you are not familiar with the term election, it is to refer to the belief in predestination, meaning that God, before he created the heaven and the earth, being all-knowing and being of perfection, would know which individuals it would be that would be the elect, and living eternity in heaven. And then there's the concept of double predestination, which means that there were some people that they were on the outside looking in. And what is important about this is that the separatist Puritans, this is the Bible that they brought with them, and this is something that is significant to their understanding. Again, this is a great resource if you want to know a little bit more about how the separatists and the Puritans felt. Do a little bit of studying on the Geneva Bible. There's certainly many different Bibles out there. One also that's very popular, as we all know, is the King James Bible, and that is from the Church of England, again, which would be what today would be considered to be the Episcopalian faith. Here is a picture of John Carver with Osamequin, also known as Massasoit. I'm referring to him now as Massasoit because this is representing the Treaty of 1621 of the Common Era, and what's clearly of the Common Era. And so this is certainly interesting. Again, it's John Carver. This is approximately 1 month, a depiction of their relationship and the signing of the treaty 1 month before he would die. I would argue, although I certainly have an incredible amount more reading to do about it, but I would argue that that was a treaty that certainly brought fairly decent relations between the Wampanoags and that of the Pilgrims for a period of time. Without question, there is a lot of evidence to support that outside of this community, that there was a lot of conflict between various Native American groups and various Puritan or Christian colonizers. So I want to ask, and I get to use my laser pointer, thank you. I want to ask, I'm not sure how clearly everyone can see this, but if you just look, just kind of in this section right here, because I'm not going to have you look at the whole picture, but in this section right here, I want to ask, what do you think is wrong, if this were a picture, which it is, but if it was it's a picture of a statue, obviously. What would you say, just looking at that, is something that probably is not likely? Anyone have any guess?
Would it be the hat?
It would, but what specifically about the hat? Well, for the sake of time, I'll just get into it. Right here, there's a buckle. We all grew up. We saw a lot of pictures of Puritans, and they had buckles on their shoes, and they had buckles on their hats. This would have not happened. This would have been too ornate. Puritans were not ornate. They were not ostentatious. If you go into a Roman Catholic cathedral, or even an Episcopalian church, you're going to see things that are far more ornate. You go into what is now a present-day Congregationalist church, which are the descendants of those separatists and Puritans. It's going to be considerably less, it's going to be considerably less ostentatious and I think that's a very conservative assessment of that comment. So it's interesting to point out. So the next time that you see something like that, it's highly unlikely that that's what we would have seen. So what I'm going to do is, this is the only time I'm going to read off this slide. This is another excerpt of Winslow's letter back to England. Again, this is written in the new period as opposed to the Gregorian calendar. So it's written it's written in the new period. I'll just leave it at that. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest of their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and we feasted. And also, in addition to this, I will mention, because I don't think it's in my notes, we were talking about this just prior to the presentation. Yes, there was turkey. Bradford had, a few days earlier, had given orders to his men to go out and hunt fowl. So there was various forms of fowl. We do know that turkey existed in England because there's cases of turkey being eaten during the Christmas holiday in England prior to this. So we know that they did eat turkey. And as commonly mentioned, is that Massasoit and the Native Americans did end up bringing I believe it's 5 deer to the gathering. And again, this is from Edward Winslow's primary source material. Now, I'm going to ask, again, just based on what I just said, although this picture is certainly could be a little bit clearer, and I'm not asking for anything specific, looking at this very, very well-known painting of the first Thanksgiving, a depiction of the first Thanksgiving, anything stand out based on what I was just mentioning about the two parties that were there?
They're too clean.
Okay, that's not what I was getting at, but I guess that's a possibility.
The woman's dress, it's too...
Well, it's interesting you bring that. A misnomer is that certainly the Puritans did drink beer, right? Purity of water, and they did drink alcohol. They didn't all wear black. That has been commonly referred to. You often see Puritans wearing lace, the separatists wearing lace. So I don't interpret that as being that. That may be the case, but that's not my interpretation. But the Winslow tells us in the previous slide that, second sentence, with some 90 men, and we know, based on what I was saying earlier, that the Pilgrims were down to 54 people by the first Thanksgiving. So, although I would say, at first glance, you got somewhat similar amount. I mean, you see here that the two central figures in this photograph is this young man and this woman, and perhaps these two men, and you have Native Americans over here, Wampanoags over there. But certainly they were outnumbered 2-1. So it's not really that honest of a depiction. I'm not going to go as far as to say it's deliberately going out of its way to be dishonest, but with the evidence that we have, we know now that they were outnumbered essentially 2-1 in a more accurate depiction. Certainly a photograph today, if that was a situation, would show a different picture.
Excuse me, I have a question too about the going back to the other slide. You were saying before about the assumption about all Native Americans at the time living in teepees, and we were talking about how that wasn't the case, and that in the New England area they had the Weetus, and what about the headdresses on the Native Americans in this image here? Is that my question would be, is that true to New England and how they would have presented themselves in England, or is that more of that that Midwestern kind of concept of indigenous peoples wearing headdresses? And is that an accurate depiction? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot like the sources, especially the further you go back in time, the sources vary even on the same subject. I have read that. I've read in some sources that Native Americans, when they had the headdresses, it was really only a headdress like that when they were on a war party, and it wasn't just kind of like a communal. So that I can't speak to that. I can't give you an honest answer, especially when it comes to the Wampanoags. I did want to clarify, just for the rest of the people, that that we were talking prior to the meeting about the difference between Native Americans trans-Mississippi West in the 19th century. What really changed was the horse culture that the Mexicans or the Spaniards ended up introducing to the North American continent, that it changed the whole concept of how you were able to be mobile, because the Native Americans, when they had teepees, which they did not have in New England, the weather wouldn't have permitted it. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'll just leave it at they didn't have teepees. Is that it made them far more mobile, because you can break down a teepee and have a horse drag it much more quickly than than the dogs that we used prior to that. But I'll be happy to try to find out that answer for you. If you want to give me your email after this is over, I'll be happy to track that down. I'm frequently doing research, and you certainly would be in enjoyment to try to figure out what that answer is. So we're getting to the end of the primary source material. This is courtesy of the Pilgrim Hall Museum. This is a pot that we do know was on the Mayflower. It was owned by Miles Standish. I cannot say for certainty that it was a pot that was used for cooking at the first Thanksgiving, but it's likely. I mean, how many utensils and pots did they really have? But it was on the Mayflower, so you can interpret that information for what you will. Some of the other things that I want to wrap up with is that the Pilgrims did not consider the gathering of Thanksgiving to be their Thanksgiving. They were giving thanks to a great harvest, and that was part of their religious actions, was to give thanks. So it wasn't, my understanding is this wasn't kind of like a set, hey, this is going to be a Thanksgiving, let's do this for another 400 years until tonight. It didn't really work out that way. Incidentally, we do know that there was a second gathering referred to as a Thanksgiving in 1623 for the very purposes of their crops were not coming in, and then my understanding is that there was a great rain, and the rain changed around the crops, and they gave Thanksgiving for that. And I also believe that that was religious based as well. It's from to me, what I would consider my interpretation of common sense is that when you have a group of people such as the Pilgrims that are very, very much in hunger, people are dying off, people are being buried in secret because they don't want to see the weakness, they don't want the Wampanoags to see their weakness, that when a great harvest comes in, it's understandable that you're going to build a stronger relationship, especially with a group of people that have helped you out. So you're allying on both sides. You've got the Wampanoags that are saying, okay, well, we've been decimated and we've got the Narragansetts to our east, and this might not be a bad situation to have as an ally. And certainly on the other side, from the Pilgrim standpoint, they were very much saved. I mean, I find it hard to believe that Usamequem could have just sat there and said, you know, we don't really need you. But you can see, it's certainly, I'm not going to argue this, but I certainly will suggest that there is a form of a mutual dependence on one another. And then lastly, the exact date, as I have alluded to earlier by talking about the first 10 months, is it's likely that it was September and October. It just happens to be that in 1863, President Lincoln ended up making Thanksgiving, being the fourth Thursday in November, to be a national holiday. And so it's really been since that period of time that, and of course that is what's Lincoln doing. Lincoln's trying to bring together the country, right? That's the whole goal. I also would argue, and I'm not going to get too far off this, is that the American Civil War was not about, as has been previously written, about states' rights to secede. I'm sure authors that are favorable to the South or to the period of antebellum might argue differently, but I would argue that Lincoln and his administration made it about slavery. They just knew, because of the bordering states having slaves, that they would not have made it about slavery, but it was about slavery, I would argue. And I bring that up because, again, the entire American Civil War, antebellum, the war postbellum, was all about trying to, postbellum with the failure of Reconstruction, I believe, was about uniting the country. And this is probably one of the more important slides, and it's the last slide, I'm not sure of the time frame here, is that it is important to note that, that the fourth Thursday of November, for not all people, is considered to be a day of Thanksgiving. Since 1970, it has been considered to be a day of mourning, and every fourth Thursday in November, you can go to Plymouth, and there is a gathering of Wampanoags as well as other people who support the belief in it being a day of mourning. And this started off in 1970 with a Native American, I believe his name is posthumous now, was Woonsada. His name was Frank James, and he wanted to give a speech on the 350th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower, and his speech was not considered to be politically correct for 1970 sensibilities and for the individuals that would have been receiving it. So he went to Coles Hill and he gave his own speech, which at the cornerstone talks about representing the Mayflower being the start of the genocide of the Native American people in that area. With that said, I will gladly entertain any questions. Thank you very much.